White initiates the game with the king's pawn opening. A classic and direct approach aiming for central control. This move establishes immediate influence in the center and opens lines for the king's bishop and queen. Black responds with the Sicilian defense. A solid and asymmetrical counter to White's central pawn push. This move fights for central space and prepares for potential counterplay on the queenside. White develops the king's knight to its natural square, preparing to castle and reinforcing control over the in squares. This is a standard move in many openings, including the Sicilian. Black supports the pawn and prepares to develop the king's bishop. This move also opens a diagonal for the dark squared bishop. White challenges the center with opening lines and creating tension. This is a critical move in the Sicilian defense, aiming to break open the center. The move the pawn on the c-file takes on d4 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to a6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White recaptures with the knight, developing a piece and maintaining central presence. This move adheres to opening principles of rapid development and central control. Black develops the king's knight, attacking White's central pawn and preparing for kingside castling. This is a natural developing move that puts pressure on White's center. White develops the queen's knight, adding another piece to the central fight and preparing for kingside castling. This move also defends the central pawn indirectly. Black plays a prophylactic move, preventing White's advance and preparing queenside expansion. This move aims to restrict White's space on the queenside. The move the pawn to g3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to b3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black challenges White's central pawn, opening the center and creating dynamic possibilities. This move aims to disrupt White's pawn structure. White repositions the knight too, potentially preparing to double knights or reroute it to a more active square like or. This offers flexibility in central pawn structures. Black develops the king's bishop to a solid square, preparing for kingside castling and reinforcing the center. This move also connects the rooks after castling. White fianchettos the king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the center. This is part of White's plan to control key squares from a distance. Black castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks. This is a crucial step in consolidating the position. White castles kingside, mirroring Black's move and bringing the king to safety. Both sides have now completed their initial kingside development. The move the knight on the b-file to d7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight on the b-file to d7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight on the e-file to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the rook to b8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to h3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to f4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to b6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to c7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black advances the b-pawn, aiming for queenside expansion and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move also opens a diagonal for the queen. White develops the bishop too, aiming to control central squares and prepare for potential pawn breaks. This piece actively influences the center. The move the bishop to b7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to b4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the knight takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the queen takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the rook to b8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to d2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to f4 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to g4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to c7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to e8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to a3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on f4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on f4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to g4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to d5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the knight takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on e5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to b4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to b6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the bishop to f2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook on the f-file to e8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to b4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the knight, challenging black's pawn structure and aiming for active piece play. This move seeks to improve white's piece activity. Black exchanges knights. simplifying the position and preparing to create a passed pawn on the d-file. This move aims to relieve central tension. White recaptures with the pawn, opening the d-file and centralizing the pawn. This move aims to maintain central presence. Black captures the pawn, opening lines and creating a passed pawn. This sequence leads to a dynamic pawn structure with mutual attacking chances. The move the rook takes on f4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on f4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the knight to b6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to h2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to c3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the f-file to e8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop aggressively, attacking white's rook and creating tactical threats. This move disrupts white's coordination. White repositions the rook, defending the pawn and maintaining a central presence. This move aims to consolidate the position. Black captures the bishop, simplifying the position and improving their pawn structure. This exchange is favorable for black. White recaptures the bishop, regaining material but opening the position for black's rooks. This exchange leads to a more open game. Black centralizes the rook, aiming for maximum activity and preparing to attack on the open file. This move targets white's king. White exchanges rooks, simplifying the position and reducing black's attacking potential. This aims to ease the pressure. Black recaptures with the rook, maintaining pressure on the semi-open file and keeping attacking chances alive. This rook is now actively placed. The move the queen to d2 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to a3, claiming key space in the center, allowing the queen to c5 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the knight to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on b4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the f-file takes on b4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black delivers a check with the queen, forcing white's king to a vulnerable square and increasing pressure. This checks for potential tactical opportunities. The move the king to h1 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to d4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the rook to f1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black centralizes the queen, targeting weak squares and preparing a decisive attack. This move capitalizes on white's defensive weaknesses.